I was always a very sensitive, artistic child. I was very much into the arts and music. And so kind of spheres that traditionally are very boy or masculine, I felt a little insecure in. I did recognize that I had these attractions to other men. And I thought maybe this is something that God doesn't know what's best for me.
I think there were so many times that I perceived offense that was never actually there, but I was just so hardwired and kind of amped up to perceive it that I picked up on anything that was there, even when it wasn't in any way intentional.
Megan was the person who knew all of my faults, foibles, and warts. And still, of all the men in the world, she chose to give her greatest gift, the gift of herself and her body. She chose to give it to me. That's how much she trusted.
Unfortunately, most churches, most Christians are not experiencing anything close to the level that God desires us to, even in men's groups and women's groups and small groups. But most of those groups are not deep enough. People are not willing to be fully vulnerable, maybe a little bit, but not fully vulnerable.
You know, when you can kind of share your deepest, darkest secrets and people don't run away screaming. And in my experience, I've often found the more common response in the churches I've been in is, thanks for sharing that. You know, this is what I've been going through.
Level of healing that we can experience, the level of restoration that we can experience is to the degree that we're willing to be clear about what we're wrestling with, what we're struggling with, or what we're failing in. But then the other boundary is not oversharing.
I never would have chosen to have this struggle in my life, but there are many things that have come out of it that I'm very grateful for. That opened my heart to receive grace, right? That it's not something I deserve or merit. That God's love for me had not changed one iota.
Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We're excited to have you here with us today. And I have really a longtime friend. We haven't spent a ton of time together, but we've known each other for quite some time. When back in the day when Melissa and I were still based in upstate New York, and we started Love and Truth Network up in that region, I did spend quite a bit of time in New York City and grew to love that city. I'm a little uncertain about how I'd feel about it these days, but I grew to love that city back in the day, and Andrew was kind of a part of that in different ministries churches, whatever, that I connected with down there. Somehow our path crossed, and we've just kind of stayed connected. There's crossroads that happens every now and then through different ministry events or different situations. And so I'd reached out to Andrew and just asked, hey, I'd love to have you share your story for our podcast. Would love to just have a conversation with you. And I think you're going to be really blessed by hearing from Andrew today. So Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd love for you just to kind of begin sharing some of your own story and what kind of transpired in your life that led into some areas of confusion and struggle and those kinds of things, where you met Jesus in the middle of all that. And just also, you know, I think one of the most important things of our story is there are times that God shows up and just in a miraculous kind of way delivers certain areas of our life, or maybe one area of our life. I'm not sure that I've had that happen too many times. I'm trying to think back. It's for me, and for I think most of us, it's this process of discipleship and this journey, and sometimes kind of falling forward, you know, and sometimes falling backward, I guess, a bit. But the Lord's faithfulness in striving with us and moving us and wooing us and drawing us. And I think there's some aspects of your story that kind of fit that description. But I'd love for you to kind of share your story with our audience today.
So I'd love to share a little of my journey, Gary. When you were talking about how did I come to know Jesus, that's one of the bright spots of my story. And I count myself so blessed to have been raised by Christian parents who really loved the Lord and they weren't perfect by any means, but they genuinely loved the Lord and served Him and wanted to raise me to know Him. So I was 5 years old, and I was at a Christmas cantata by Assemblies of God, and the pastor said, my parents were on stage singing, and I was in the audience, and I heard the pastor say, if you want to go to heaven and be with Jesus when you die, all you have to do is pray this prayer with me. And I remember thinking at 5 years old, That's such an easy question to answer. Who wouldn't want to be with Jesus forever when they died? And so I prayed that prayer and I told my parents. And, in the years since, I've sometimes wondered, like, how much did I understand? And there was so much life and struggle yet to be experienced. But I really do think, if we have the faith of a child, God honors
Yeah.
that. And the gospel grace really is a gift freely given and freely received. And I think it really was that simple and that easy. And somehow as a kid, as a child, I kind of intrinsically understood that, or intuitively understood that. I came from a very strong faith background and always knew the Lord. I think in terms of my struggle with identity and my sexual identity in particular, I was always a very sensitive, artistic child. I was very much into the arts and music. And so kind of spheres that traditionally are very boy or masculine, I felt a little insecure in. And so we're at times was bullied by peers or made fun of for that. And so I think all of that just kind of planted this seed of insecurity in me in terms of who I was as a man. But for the most part, my childhood felt, at the time, very normal and kind of, a positive one for the most part. And I think, I myself was so, even from a young age, really committed to the Lord and wanting to live for Him. That so even when I did have, in retrospect, I do see from my adolescence tendencies or attractions toward other men. At that time, it just kind of wasn't a possibility because for me, being a Christian meant following God's prescribed path for our lives, and to me, those two were incompatible. But I think kind of towards the end of college and after college, I started having a lot of doubts in general about my faith. I think one of the biggest doubts was this question of people who did not know God, not being able to be with Him for eternity, and kind of those who choose a life apart from Him, being destined for hell or things like that. And especially when I was in college and I was just interacting with so many people who I felt were so intelligent and generous and kind and whom I really respected and loved. It was just so hard for me to wrap my head around this idea that, wait, are they going to hell because they don't believe in Jesus? But I think that one doubt that I was grappling with made me kind of question other things. And so also I began to question, all my life I've been taught that marriage is between one man and one woman and the covenant bond that God has blessed. But, I did recognize that I had these attractions to other men. And I thought maybe this is something that God doesn't know what's best for me and that I can explore. So kind of in my early 20s, I won't go into too much detail, but I definitely kind of dipped my toe into the waters of the gay lifestyle. And, I think God was merciful to me in that I didn't get too far into it. But, Garry, when you're talking about, there are some moments where God, really, I don't know what language you use, but there's kind of a wow moment or a come to Jesus moment.
As sudden moment. Yeah.
And, I remember
deliverance. Yeah.
One night I had been out doing a bunch of things I didn't need to be doing. And I just had this sense that two things hit me. One was that, I had gotten myself into a situation that could have potentially been destructive and dangerous to me. And I just got kind of freaked out by how out of control my life felt. And I thought, I certainly cannot be trusted to make responsible choices with my own life. So maybe God can. But the second thing was, during this time of kind of exploring or rebellion, I had certainly felt a breach in my relationship with God. I knew that things were not right between me and the Lord. And I just missed Him. I missed the Lord being in my life, and I missed talking to Him and having that sense of connection with Him. So, I sat at the foot of my bed, and I remembered a pastor once saying you should never make bargains with God because you're in no position to bargain with him, being the subtext. But I said, all I could pray was, okay, Lord, if you get me out of this situation that I'm in, if you rescue me, then I'll recommit my life to you. Totally a bargain, right? Like, if you save me, God, I'll recommit my life to you. But I will also say, Gary, it was probably the most honest prayer I had prayed in a really long time. And I think in retrospect, any step we take towards God, towards returning to him, towards returning to the Father, he'll take that and he'll meet us there. So shortly after that, I knew, I said, hey, I need help if I'm going to recommit my life to the Lord and turn from this lifestyle and overcome my same-sex attraction. So I went home and I talked with my parents. Shortly after that, I connected with Frank Worthen's ministry.
Okay.
In California,
I forgot about that.
To retreat. And it was life-changing. And I loved that what they focused on was not the fruit of the sin, these actions or ways that I had acted out, but rather on the root cause, which was just that I was looking for my identity and love and affection somewhere besides Christ. And so everything was coming back to that, towards that, my relationship with Christ and my identity with him. And then I got involved with a men's discipleship group in New York called Higher Ground, run by our friend Peter Anderson. And through that, I unpacked a lot more of what God was trying to do in my life in ways that he was trying to heal kind of these deep wounds and doubts about my own masculinity. Through most of my and then the Lord did a work in my life, and it wasn't easy, or it was often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think I was at least consistent, in making the effort and going to meetings and being in counseling and being involved in my local church. And I think God began to do a work in me. And so kind of by my 30s, I felt like my life and had been put together enough to the point that I wanted to get married to a woman. And plus I was really unhappily single and desperately lonely. And so, I tried dating and I had a lot of fits and starts. And there were many times I thought, what, maybe God just doesn't have this in store for me. But I guess when I was at the ripe old age of 37, I met my now wife at a Bible study. We were at a church in Brooklyn. I loved that she had a heart for missions, and I felt not a lust for her, but certainly an attraction from the first time I saw her. Like, oh, who's this girl who's talking about wanting to serve the Lord in medical missions? And so I asked her out, and we started dating. I disclosed pretty early on my history, and she was really gracious. And I had prayed God would lead me to someone who had a supernatural gift for understanding this part of my story and supporting me. But the real challenge for me, Gary, was not discerning if she was the right one for me. I was pretty sold on that pretty early on, but was I up to the task? And I think I had felt so ashamed and so guilty of the things I had done and the ways I still struggled that I felt like I wasn't worthy of a godly woman. And that I kind of wouldn't want to inflict myself on such a great person, with kind of all this baggage that I carried. And it was really through a Cross Currents group, which is part of Living Waters.
Desert Stream Living Waters.
Yeah, that one of the truths we learned was that, we are created as a good gift. And our gender is a good gift to the body of Christ and potentially to a spouse someday. And Megan was the one who really helped me to be able to renounce that lie that I wasn't good enough because of my past or because of the ways I still struggled. But to say, I am a good gift, just as God created me. And my manhood is a good gift to Megan if this is what he has in store for us. So really it was the Lord working through Megan that kind of broke those lies of shame and guilt that I had carried around for so long. And yeah, just the freedom I've experienced with her and since then has been unreal. It's been such a blessing.
So great. And you've been married now how many years?
7.
7 years.
Mm-hmm.
And
7, and we have 2 kids.
Okay.
We have a boy who's 2.5, almost 3, and our daughter is 3 months old.
That's great.
Yeah,
how exciting is that?
It's a chaotic house.
Yeah. And Andrew, how old are you?
46.
46.
Sorry,
okay.
Do the math. Yeah.
No. That's so when my oldest son was born, I was 42. And then my next oldest or my youngest, I was 44. So the irony of that is no, other way around. I was I was 44, and then I was 46 actually when my youngest was born, and so I was the same. I was the same age as my dad when they found out that my mom was pregnant with me, and they did not want to have any of that to start with. I mean, they definitely did not want to have another child. And so it's just, I don't know, in some ways there's an irony there. There's something about, God. I mean, I'm grateful that I am the age I am having my boys now. And I feel like in many ways, probably just because of a lot of the craziness that my life was, obviously, but I'm grateful that I'm an older guy being a dad to teenage boys now. And I wouldn't trade that stuff for the world. I mean, what a joy to be married to Melissa for 17 years now. So a little bit longer than you guys, but there was after you got married, Andrew, I remember you had written you'd written something back to Desert Stream Ministries because you'd gone through Living Waters and Cross Current, those kind of things. And you'd also copied me on it as well when I was a regional coordinator for Living Waters Desert Stream. And honestly, I wish I could think of the right language to use for it, but it was unbelievable, the words that God gave you. It was like reading poetry of the richest and most beautiful form when you were talking about the idea of seeing Megan and on your honeymoon and just being with her and just knowing you were made for her. That there was something so profound about this male-female union and what God's original design and intent was, that it's like you got it in a way that I don't think most men even fully embrace that or appreciate that. And a lot of that comes out of our struggles, our struggles to kind of discover who we are, and not in the cultural sense of going and finding ourselves and breaking up a marriage and ruining a family to go off and go off into who knows what, but rather to find ourselves in terms of who God created us to be, really, as men made in His image. And do you recall writing that? Do you recall anything about that you could share?
Vaguely, as you were sharing this story, I was like, I remember writing that. I don't quite remember what I said.
The language of it, I've looked for it. Actually, I've gone back and I've searched through my hard drives.
I'll look if I have it in
trying to find it, because it was profound.
Yeah. I mean, I will say this, Gary. I think one thing I struggled with even early in our marriage was that, for so long for me, and part of this is culture, maybe part of this is legalism, part of it is true conviction, but like, sex and sexual acts has so long been considered something to be avoided or dirty, or that brings guilt or shame. And there certainly are boundaries that sex should be contained in biblically. But in marriage, it was so healing to finally understand that these desires are not something just to be repressed or tamped down or, to try to get them to as low a level as possible, but to be expressed in love, in self-giving love to this person who means everything to you. I mean, for me, Megan was the person who knew all of my faults, foibles, and warts. And still, of all the men in the world, she chose to give her greatest gift, the gift of herself and her body. She chose to give it to me. That's how much she trusted me.
Yeah.
And so within that marriage union, it's no longer a matter of, oh, what am I getting this, or am I attracted to this part of her or this part of her? But it's like, oh my goodness, how can I give and give pleasure and give connection to this woman who has given everything she is to me?
Yes.
And then to then experience sex not as something to be ashamed of, but really as this holy thing, and I use that word holy very intentionally, as like this holy union that God has given us that's also fun and joyful, but also so healing, and for both me and Megan, I think marriage and the physical intimacy, that has been such an agent of God's healing in our lives, and for both of us to just become more secure in who we are as man and woman and who we are as his creations.
Yeah. Well, I love that. In part of your story, you mentioned the idea of whether it was church, whether it was showing up to Higher Ground, the support group, whether it was counseling or whatever, that you were consistent. And whenever I came into town, and I just let you know, hey, I'm going to be there, and you were all. There wasn't a time, I don't think, that you were there that you're like, hey, let's just grab dinner. I'd love to run some things by you. And whenever I went to these different groups, you were there, and there is something really to be said. There have been so many times in my past when, I was kind of coming back around to God again, or trying to sort of put my toe in the water of the church and those kinds of things, and maybe was even in it for a while, or was pressing into some deeper opportunities or some counseling or whatever. But there was also many of those times where it really was just what I described. I'm sticking my toe in instead of diving in, and I'm waiting. I'm posturing for someone to shame me or to be rejected, or I'm just anticipating that. And sure enough, either it would come, or more often than not, I think actually, as I grew into a young man and into my 20s and 30s. I think there were so many times that I perceived offense that was never actually there, but I was just so hardwired and kind of amped up to perceive it that I picked up on anything that was there, even when it wasn't in any way intentional. So my point in saying all that is the word consistency, I think, is such a key thing. I'd love for you to just, for our audience, just to unpack, why was consistency such an important part of your process of the Lord meeting you and bringing healing over time?
Two things come to mind in terms of consistency. The first is that transformation and sanctification is a process. It
Yes.
doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
I think God transforms us, but over time, and sometimes imperceptibly. And there were many times where maybe I didn't feel like showing up to group, or I didn't feel like going to accountability group, but it was kind of just being there day in and day out, that even when I didn't feel like it, that slowly my emotions and attractions, and we can talk more about attractions changing or not. I think it's a little different for everybody, but for me, slowly and over time, the desires of my heart began to align more, I think, with what God wanted to me. And so consistency to me is important because it's not going to happen overnight, or at least it didn't for me.
Right.
So giving God that space and time to work.
Yeah, I think I was so apt to just get discouraged quickly, and I was also kind of looking for the, if not instant fix, the, I don't know, quicker fix than a discipleship process. And when that didn't happen, and I'm feeling lonely or angry, hungry, tired, bored, whatever, those opportunities or those times when I didn't choose consistency, it was pretty easy to get derailed again. I think you were starting to say something else though, Andrew.
I can certainly relate to that, in moments of weakness, or when I felt like, I'm trying to do it God's way, but I'm still single and things weren't working out. It was very easy to kind of give into this idea. Well, I'll just find some affection, even if it's not within God's bounds. But I think for me, the other thing I was going to say was, The bigger problem for me in that journey, I think, kind of just due to my temperament and how I grew up, was when I did make a mistake or fall, was actually receiving God's forgiveness,
Yeah.
picking myself up and moving on, rather than kind of staying stuck there in this cycle of self condemnation and just berating myself, like, oh, how could you do that again after you've known better for so long?
Yep.
And so, of course, we never want to take sin lightly, but I think for me, a big lesson was also keeping the cross of Christ central, and the fact that His forgiveness, it's real, and that the whole point of the gospel is that we're not perfect. We still make mistakes,
Right.
but that grace is there, and that He is always um, there, waiting for us to return to Him, and that when we do, He encourages us and He receives us, and He's our biggest cheerleader.
Mm-hmm. How important was it for you to have people in your life who knew your struggle and had some ideas of that? When I say how important, I mean, you can't grade it, obviously, but speak a little bit to the importance of having those kind of folks in your life on that consistent basis.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly important to me just to have somebody that I could call up anytime, day or night, and say, hey, this is what I'm struggling with, or, I looked at this online and I shouldn't have, or, this thought came to me. And for me, kind of being specific in that sort of confession was very, very freeing.
Yes.
I think a lot of the power of sin is in the secrecy or the shame that we carry. And when you just kind of speak it out loud to another brother in Christ, it breaks some of that. And I say I never would have chosen to have this struggle in my life, but there are many things that have come out of it that I'm very grateful for. The most important is that, I had kind of grown up as the goody two shoes, do gooder Christian boy.
Mm-hmm.
But once this issue of SSA erupted in my life, it was the first time I had actually done everything wrong, but that opened my heart to receive grace, right? That it's not something I deserve or merit, that even though I had done everything wrong, God's love for me had not changed one iota. At all. He loved me just the same, and He was still ready. And so kind of that understanding of grace, I don't know if I would have had I not had this struggle. The other thing that I'm really grateful for is the friendships that have come through it, and other guys I've met along this very journey who have become some of my closest friends, and
Right.
Kind of the depth of relationship that we have, and it's gotten to the point. I have a couple guys that I'm on with a call with every week, and we've been doing this for, I don't know, maybe 10 years now, certainly from before I was married. It's no longer just about, SSA issues or temptation, but it's about life, about evangelism and growing in Christ, and jobs and coworkers and kids. But yeah, I tell them, a lot of Christian guys out there, they don't have really close relationships where they can be vulnerable and transparent with other men. So I count myself really blessed to have those guys in my life.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly those listening or watching this have heard me talk about this quite a bit. But what you're describing in that is not just something that you needed or I needed or a few people need. It's what we were made for. It's so few Christian men, and honestly, so few Christian women actually have regular times together. And here you're talking about weekly for 10 years or so, but have regular times together in person or online or whatever, where they're just being real, where they're putting out their, Andrew Comiskey calls it our weakness. He says we all have weakness. And if we refuse to let our weakness be known, it will ultimately become wickedness. And so the antidote to sin and wickedness is dragging our stuff that we wish weren't a part of our life. We wish we weren't struggling with. We wish it wasn't a part of our temptations, but dragging that stuff out into the light so that some other trusted brothers know we can be prayed for, and really receive his mercy, and also even the pronouncement of forgiveness, which of course comes from him alone, but even hearing those words that are true based on the scriptures has a real power for sure. Can you, and I just want to again say, if you don't have that as you're listening or watching this podcast, that is part of what you were made for. It's part of your birthright as a son or daughter of God. But unfortunately, most churches, most Christians are not experiencing anything close to the level that God desires us to, even in men's groups and women's groups and small groups. Those are nice, and in many ways maybe they run even deeper than just nice, but most of those groups are not deep enough. People are not willing to be fully vulnerable, maybe a little bit, but not fully vulnerable. And we need places where we can be totally, fully vulnerable. How would you describe, Andrew, the difference, and change this around and put it into your own words? But I've been in lots of groups, men's groups and small groups. I've been in lots of groups where there's fellowship going, there's a book study, there might even be a Bible study going on. We have some prayer time together. But I left feeling completely empty because I didn't feel, I was too afraid to, and I'm not sure it was even safe to even bring out some of the stuff that I was struggling with or needing prayer for. But what do you find in your own life, the difference between having kind of a generic group that may be topic based or Sunday Rewind, and those can be really good, but the difference between that and having this tighter knit group?
I mean, I appreciate what you said, Gary, because I do think there's a place for all kinds of groups, and I've certainly benefited from different kinds of groups. But yeah, I mean, when you have a chance to really share the deepest parts of yourself and know that you are still accepted and loved, hopefully it's a safe place, like you mentioned, and people there understand grace. But when you can kind of share your deepest, darkest secrets and people don't run away screaming. And in my experience, I've often found the more common response in the churches I've been in is, thanks for sharing that. This is what I've been going through. I think that is a really powerful incarnation of God's love for us. Even like you were saying, when someone pronounces forgiveness over us, God's already forgiven us, but that's a means of grace to receive it from another brother. And I think it's the same with open, vulnerable sharing in the right circumstances and being judicious in how and where you share it. But yeah, absolutely. There's so much power in that and so much freedom in that.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you talked about in your story in the beginning is just I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but it stuck in my mind when you mentioned it. And it's the idea of being specific about sin issues. And so I really want to kind of spend a little bit of time there and talk about that a little bit more, because I think that there are times, well, I know there are times as somebody who's been a pastor and has had lots of people come to me for counseling and coaching and things, and then was one who's been in groups and facilitating groups, etc. Even when people try to open up, or there's ways in which a couple things we oftentimes do. We speak in kind of you language. We speak in kind of third person language rather than owning. We'll talk about, well, you shouldn't do blah, 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 or that you should turn Facebook off or get out of whatever it is that's kind of drawing you in, that's stirring up lust or whatever, and you don't. And so we speak in that kind of generalized third person kind of language instead of saying, yeah, last night when I was looking at this, I lingered over it far more than I should have, or I watched it for 30 minutes or something. And so there's a difference between being ridiculously general and I find that the level, I guess is my point, the level of healing that we can experience, the level of restoration that we can experience is to the degree that we're willing to be clear about what we're wrestling with, what we're struggling with, or what we're failing in. And but then the other boundary is not oversharing. And it's rare that people do that, but sometimes they do. And I think a leader, facilitator has to be aware of that and kind of nip that in the bud so that that doesn't go on. But usually we share way too much so that we're either generalizing everything or we're just kind of we're lumping an issue that needs to be unpacked more and be more descriptive into something that is just general, and it's not even much of a confession by the time you get done with it. So would you kind of speak to a little bit more in your own life about the value of being not overly descriptive but being specific?
Yeah. And I think I I get that instinct to kind of I think being vague is a way that we try to protect ourselves.
Yes.
Right? Like I get it. It's scary to kind of share these really personal things. And there's
Yep.
a fear of rejection. What are they going to think of me? What are they going to say? Am I going to be shunned? So if people out there are feeling like that, I get it.
Right.
It is scary to be vulnerable, but on the other side of being scared is true connection and deep
Yeah.
connection. And for those of us who have any sort of life controlling issue, it can be so isolating. And
Yes.
that's, like you said earlier, that's God created us for fellowship, for communion with each other. And so if you can get past that fear of being specific when you are specific, it unleashes the ability for this person to love you, not in spite of the generalities of how we're all fallen, but
Yep.
of how you, Garry, specifically are fallen. I see it, and
Yes.
I see you, and I still love you, and I still affirm God's grace is enough.
Yeah. Well, and I think it also, when we hold back from saying the whole thing or being specific, again, we don't have to be overly detailed, shouldn't be overly detailed. Nobody should be slimed by our story and walk away with now some massive temptation. But when we hold back from being clear, the other dynamic that I think happens, there's multiple values when we are clear, but when we hold back, there's a way in which I think we feel a sense of relief because we've said something, like maybe I struggle with lust or something, and or even I've had a problem with pornography, but the shame still sits in us
Mm.
because when no one knows because it isn't just kind of general pornography, which is, I'm not saying that that's not damaging, but it's something specific that maybe has a fetish associated with it or something. It has some kind of a hook that's unique. And by generalizing it with everyone, like even a counselor or a pastor, we generalize it and we don't name what it actually is. We walk away and have some level of feeling better that we actually, and if the response was good, there's a relief in that, but we still have a deep sense of shame because, yeah, but I didn't actually, they were kind to me, but they don't actually know what it was that I'm wrestling with. And I found that the greatest degree of breaking the power of shame in my life comes from when I'm willing to just name the thing and then experience that, not affirmation of my sin, obviously, but still affirmation of me. I walk out then with the shame being totally broken in that area, which is great.
Yeah, I think in my experience, when I leave things vague or unsaid, then that's something that Satan can take advantage of.
Yes,
And accuse.
that's right.
So, even this past week, Garry, I had a little more temptation than usual with SSA thoughts, and I knew that I wanted to talk to Megan about it, and she's always been a safe place. And rather than just saying, "Oh, I've been struggling," but like, "Hey, this morning a memory came to mind, and I gave it to the Lord, but it kind of threw me."
Yeah.
And then for her to be like, "Okay, let's pray. God has delivered you. He's going to deliver you."
Yep.
Then Satan can't come in and say, "Well, if Megan knew about that thought that flew through your mind this morning,
Yep.
or if Garry knew about this thought that, so
Yep.
Satan is the accuser, and he's going to find
Yes.
any way in. And I think bringing things into the light is such a powerful defense that God has given us.
Well, it absolutely is. And just for people that may be not aware what SSA is, you mentioned that same-sex attraction, that was the thought or the memory or whatever temptation, and that you were referencing. But yeah, I've had the same thing happen with Melissa, where there's so much value in either one of us being able to say, "Oh, I had this crappy dream," or and it involved, and give a little bit of the details or whatever, but and just to be able to step in and pray for the other one again, whether it was a dream or it was just something that kind of came out of nowhere, a temptation or what have you, like you're describing, there is a way that we can minister to one another as husbands and wives, or as brothers in Christ or sisters in Christ, that is so profound and so powerful. And how wonderful it is to have the power of that thing actually broken and bound to the cross, rather than dragging it around with us, just trying to ignore it, as it builds up more and more steam basically over us. So I love that concept.
Gary,
go ahead.
I'd like to share one thing that's been really helpful with me and one of my accountability partners. Sometimes maybe one of us will see somebody, out and about, and it'll cause our minds to go to a lustful place. And so I'll tell my friend, I'll say, Satan brought that person into your path to try to tempt you, but God allowed that so you could pray for that person. for their we don't know what that person's going through. But you can pray for their salvation, their healing, that they'll see signs and dreams and wonders, that they'll be filled with the Holy Spirit. And just kind of bringing it into that perspective. Not only do we get to pray for someone, but it kind of, for me, and I think for my accountability partner as well, kind of diffuses some of that negative association or energy there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That kind of reminds me, when you say that, I'm reminded of a buddy of mine who gave a testimony at one of the conferences I did many years ago now, probably 15 years ago or something. And he was just sharing about living in this particular metropolitan city, huge city, and just talking about, man, just struggling so much with same-sex attraction and these kinds of things. In the summertime, guys are jogging around and don't have their shirts on and all that. And finally, somebody had said to him also, have you, similar to what you just said, Andrew, like, have you started praying for these guys? Well, of course, that was the last thing kind of on his mind at the moment, but he's just trying to avoid all that. So he started praying for them. And so he became very adept at praying for guys constantly and turning his eyes away. And so he's like, hey, if you all hear about a revival that broke out in such and such a city, then you're going to know this is rooted in me praying for these, these guys. Just kind of, well, I don't know that revival's broken out yet, but anyway, we'll pray for it. We'll pray. Yeah, there you go. It was motivating for him to, but it did reorient the nature of the temptation in a lot of ways, because he's offering, he's turning what Satan meant for evil and turning it to prayer for these guys. And so it's just a powerful weapon really against the enemy. I also just would love to chat with you for a few minutes about just your marriage relationship with Megan and the reality of, I guess, connecting this, your marriage, my marriage. I know many other people who've come out of the LGBT world who have gone on to get married. I know lots that have not, that have felt like God's just called them to singleness. But I just want people to know, if they themselves are wrestling with same-sex attraction or something in the LGBT world, that doesn't automatically disqualify them from marriage to the opposite sex, to a rich and fulfilling relationship with someone of the opposite sex. But so the idea, and this is really some phrasing from Andrew Comiskey and Desert Stream Living Waters, but I loved how early on, 20 years ago when I got involved there, the phrase of the more, this idea of praying into the more that God has for me, the more that God has for us. There's always more. I don't want to settle for, even where I'm at in life now. I want to keep leaning into, Lord, what more do you have? What deeper, you talked about sanctification, what deeper levels of sanctification? I know there's plenty of stuff there, in terms of greater sanctification, but I just want people to have a sense that, even for me, I was exclusively same-sex attracted. I'd gotten to that place where I had a negative feeling of being sexually involved with a woman or thinking about marriage at some point. Like I just couldn't even seriously entertain that idea. That's kind of how exclusive that attraction was. And yet God still, in the midst of all of that, with an open hand saying, Lord, I don't know if you have marriage for me or not have marriage for me. In some ways, I kind of hope you don't, because I don't see it happening. But here's the thing. I hear a lot of people talking about, oh, well, I'm never going to get married because I don't have any attraction to they make their own decision that they're not going to do this. Where I think what we should be doing is with open hands before the Lord, saying, God, if you have this for me, you're going to have to make some real changes in my life to prepare me to be a good gift, as you were talking about earlier. And when we come to God in that way, we really, in that surrender, we open ourselves up to whatever God might want to do in our lives. And I just want to encourage people, don't block yourself into thinking you can never have marriage with the opposite sex because you've been in the LGBT world. I'd love for you to kind of speak and speak into that and share some of those thoughts too, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, Gary, I love that idea of the open hands before the Lord. We don't want to limit what God can do. He's the God who does exceedingly and abundantly, because above all we could ever ask or imagine.
Yeah.
At the same time, we don't want to direct God as to what or impose our own desires.
I've done that plenty of times. It doesn't go very well.
That
right.
You turn to Christ and you're going to get married. I know plenty of guys who have been consistent and dedicated on this journey to wholeness out of same-sex attraction, who want to get married and have never found the right person.
Yep.
But that they are still obedient, and I think living out God's call for them. But yeah, like with anything else, it's a matter of, Lord, what do you have in store for my life? And I'm not going to tell you. Of course, we tell him what to do, but in our better moments, I'm going to receive whatever you have for me. But I'm also not going to limit you and say, you cannot change my desires, or you cannot redeem my past. Of course he can, And I think that's what motivates me, is seeing, I had always hoped to get married and had attractions to women here and there, even in my growing up years. But certainly, I think kind of when I was dating, I would feel it wouldn't be like a lustful attraction to women as maybe it had been with men at some points in my past, but maybe an interest, or I would use the word a spark, and that's what I felt with Megan. Yeah. But as that grew into this relationship of unconditional love with each other, rooted in our love for God, it has just blossomed into so much more.
Yeah.
So for me, I think, and I was definitely, it's funny, Gary, you said you were like, I don't even know if part of me didn't want to get married. I was the opposite end of the spectrum. I was like, Lord, I want a wife. I'm really lonely. Yeah. I would love to have a family and be with a woman. But I many times had to return to the place before I met Megan, where I would say, Lord, this is what I want. I'm going to be honest with you. But my true prayer, and I did honestly pray this, if it will help me to know you and serve you more to be single, I pray for that. Yeah. And if it will help me to know you more and love you more to be married, I pray for that. And I think that there is value in both seasons of life. And I think that when I was single, as much as I may have bucked and railed against it, I was faithful, and I tried to be to invest wisely the time and resources God had given me. And I was able to do a lot of traveling and ministry because, as a single person, I wasn't attached. I could go to the Philippines or Vietnam at the drop of a hat, and kind of, or be at every youth group meeting at my church and really pour my life out in that way. Now that I'm married, I mean, getting an hour for this podcast, Gary, it was like a logistical circus between me and my wife. That's why I'm in my garage. I can't travel as much. I can't be as present at church for different ministries as much. But I think Megan makes me better for the kingdom in so many ways. And I know that I do the same for her. And now that we have 2 kids, our greatest ministry, and I think this as well, Gary, is raising them to know how much the Lord loves them and to love him in return. And, I look back at what my parents did, and that was just the hugest influence in my life, from a spiritual standpoint, well, from every standpoint, but particularly a spiritual standpoint,
Yeah.
Was my parents.
Yes. Yes. Well, and I want to come back to that. I want to kind of pick up with that's a perfect segue. But it occurred to me that I also just want to mention another reality that you and I probably both know people. I do for sure. I know some people who have kind of taken the bull by the horns and decided that they were going to get married coming out of LGBT issues and struggles, and they weren't ready. They didn't really do the work. They might have done some work, but they didn't really do the work, and they didn't take the time for the Lord to really bring deep healing into their lives. They just kind of rushed off, and I think in many ways thought that, well, this is going to help fix me, and so that almost always ends in disaster, and it doesn't have to, but so often it does, because marriage winds up exacerbating our issues, right? I mean, talk about if there's an institution that helps make us more holy, or the opposite, it's marriage. I mean, all of our junk gets exposed, all of our self stuff gets exposed, and this need to give ourselves for somebody else is really central in this marriage relationship. So certainly we would not be advocating for, just rush off and get married, but rather, again, that open hand posture of, Lord, I'm really willing for whatever. And also I love what you said. And I think this is so good to bring to the Lord what our heart's desire is, what we really long for. And I know it can be hard to do that when you've been doing it for 10 or 15 or 20 years or longer, but keep bringing that before the Lord, but then having that willingness, not my will, but your will be done. And so I'm just so abundantly grateful for my relationship with Melissa today. I mean, it's gotten better over the last 17 years, and then also, being able to be a father to my boys. I mean, that's so God's grace, that allows that to be the case. I know you feel that way with your kids as well. But I also wanted to, you mentioned parents, and I think we can kind of move toward a kind of a place of wrapping up our podcast here. But I have such huge admiration for and respect for my parents who have gone home to be with the Lord. And yet with my dad in particular, growing up with him, I mean, I went through seasons, and this was not your story, I don't think at all, but I went through years of really hating my father, and not wanting to be anything like him, and really pushing away from him emotionally and detaching. And in doing that, I really separated myself from anything good that he could have passed along to me, or a lot of good that he could have passed along to me. And I'm so grateful that the Lord, over the course of time, brought healing, and then to the point where my dad and I became very, very close friends in my mid 30s and onward. And he went home to be with the Lord. I think I was 43 when he, or 45 actually, when he passed away. And so, and then 5 years later, my mom went home to be with the Lord. But just to have had them live with us for many years, and for that relationship to really be restored and made tight, and a deep bond there, I'm so grateful for those years. And how would you kind of talk about, I mean, what is your sense? I know that you're grateful for the upbringing you had with your mom and dad. I think there'd always been a pretty close and open connection with them, hasn't there?
Yeah, I would say that's true for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really appreciate what you shared, Garry, about your dad. I think that's really beautiful. I think that for a lot of us from any background, kind of as we're in young adulthood and kind of figuring out our journeys and who we are, it's easy to look back and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe my parents did X, Y, and Z.
Yes. Right. How clueless are they?
I mean? It was hard. My parents are in ministry. You kind of feel like you have to be perfect because everybody's watching the minister's kid. That was a lot. My parents, for the most part, had a great marriage, but it wasn't perfect. Nobody's is. And sometimes my dad would have these flashes of anger that made me really afraid of him, and kind of withdraw from him, and feel like I had to be perfect so as not to give him an excuse to explode at me. And I think there are different ways, kind of all of that may have contributed to some of my struggles. But I also remember when I kind of started unpacking my own issues regarding my identity and masculinity, I started sharing those with some of my dad. And I didn't know how he would respond, if he would be kind of defensive or try to avoid the issue. But he was repentant. That was the word that he was. He just said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I so wanted to be a good dad to you." And I said, he was a good dad, and I always told him that. But I think the beautiful thing is, I think that as God began to do that work in me, he also did a work in my parents.
Yes.
Of drawing them closer to him. So I think that transparency was great. But for parents who may have kids who are struggling with issues of sexual identity, I think, and I think about my own kids and how I can parent them. And I don't know if they're going to have the struggle of same-sex attraction, but they're going to have some struggle in their life. They're going to have some sin issue. And I think what my parents did so well is I still remember kind of going all the way back to the beginning of our talk when I was in my rebellion against the Lord, but my life fell apart, and I said, okay, I'm going to give my life back to the Lord. One of the first things I did was I flew home. I was living on the East Coast. I flew home to my parents in Hawaii, and I wanted to tell them everything that had been going on, because I knew I needed their help if I was going to give my life back to the Lord. I look back on that and I remember not so much what they said. They were very supportive and wanted to be present to me, but just the fact that that was where I ran when I needed help, and I was confident that I knew it would be hard for them, but I also knew that they'd be there for me and that they'd love me. I mean, what an amazing gift for a kid to have from his parents, and so. I want to do that for my kids, to let them know whatever happens in this life, win or lose, succeed or fail, if you mess up, I'm going to be here for you, and I'm going to love you, and I'm going to pray for you, and we're going to get through this together.
Yes. Well, so there's a wide range of people listening to this podcast that the thing we know for sure is that everybody has parents, and sometimes those parents. I mean, one of my buddies, he's never known his father. I think his dad took off even before he was pregnant, or before he was born. His mother was pregnant, and he took off before he was ever born, and has never known him, not even a little bit, and. So you've got people in that situation. You have people in situations where a parent or both were pretty abusive or neglectful. We have parents that have sexually abused children, those kinds of things. And so there's this whole range of what it looks like as an adult now, who in some cases, an adult would long for reconciliation, and now the parent's dead, and how do you ever bring closure to that? And I think there's a way that God can help bring closure to that, and especially in using the body of Christ in that situation. But for parents that are still alive, then you have the dynamic of they won't take any ownership, over, they won't even acknowledge what they did necessarily. I had a similar experience, different situation, but a similar experience where my dad really acknowledged, also in his older years, acknowledged that he was tough to live with growing up, and he didn't do a great job as a dad, and he was really repentant and even tearful about it. I mean, that was incredibly healing, and not everyone gets that. But I also want to just speak to those whose parent that they have a hard time with, or had a hard time growing up with, is still alive. Sometimes within us as adult children, we've put up the wall, and we put up a wall a long time ago, defensive detachment against our parent. And that wall's never come down, even though we may love Jesus and we are serving in the church, and maybe we've gone on to get married and have kids in our own family. But is there a chance that your parent, your mom or your dad, is open to a reconciliation, that they're open to actually have a conversation? And yet, for me, I just kept putting a wall up, and I didn't want to have that conversation. It was a hard conversation. I thought that my dad would never process it well. He wouldn't fully understand it. And the Lord just really prepared his heart for me to come and talk with him. And the truth is, what I realized later, actually, it was months, maybe even a couple of years later, I kept thinking, well, I don't have this big burden that I need to have released. Anything my dad has done, I've forgiven him for. I love him. We have a good relationship. What is the point of me saying this to him? And it wasn't until much later I realized God didn't really do that so much for me. There was a benefit to it, and I'm grateful for it. But God really did that for my dad. God really did that to give my dad a chance to ask for forgiveness and to acknowledge, even at that point, he was probably in his early 80s. And even then, to be able to fully acknowledge that. And it was just a beautiful thing that helped to release him even more. So I would just encourage people that are listening, don't just rush off based on what we're talking about or what I'm saying, but be prayerful about that. Check in with the Lord. See if there's something He's going to be prompting your heart to maybe go back and revisit something with a parent. And if you're listening to this and you're older, is there something that you need to talk to an adult child about, perhaps, of owning something or confessing something to them about the way your harshness or whatever growing up and the way that you raise them? So I just think we have to be open-hearted and leaning into the reconciliation that God so loves to give. Reconciliation is not always possible, but wherever it is possible, it does bring so much healing. So on any of those thoughts, as we wrap up, Andrew, is there anything that resonates with you, or you feel like there's something else you want to add that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Oh, that's so beautiful, Garry, what you shared about your dad. And it just makes me think, God used that to set him free too. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the God we serve. His desire is to extend His love to us and to set us free. And even though it can be scary or something that we're reluctant to do, we always have to remember whatever God is calling us to do, it is out of His great and infinite love for us. That even as you were saying with Living Waters, there's something more. He has more for us that He wants to give us if we'll only yield to Him.
That's right. Well, Andrew, it's been great to get caught up with you a little bit more, and I just appreciate your time in carving out 60 minutes or so to chat with us.
Absolutely. And thank you, Garry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We hope that you'll join us for another episode down the road, and we look forward to seeing you there. Take care. We so appreciate the time you've just invested with us in our Transforming Congregations podcast. To join us for future podcasts, dial into transformingcongregations.org/podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in a future podcast.